The Galactic Council made one mistake, angering humanity. The first thing they did when I walked into that chamber was laugh. Not all of them. Some species do not laugh the way we do, but the Volcae did. Their long, scaled necks curved back, their jaw plates split wide, and that dry, rasping sound filled the upper gallery of the celestial nexus like dry leaves scraping stone. I had prepared for hostility. I had prepared for cold indifference. I had not prepared for being laughed at. My name is Ilara Voss. I am 43 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, and on that day I was the single representative of 8 billion human beings standing inside the most powerful political chamber in the known galaxy. I had spent 11 years learning 3 alien dialects. I had memorized the procedural code of the Council down to its smallest subclauses. I had worn the formal blue coat of Earth's diplomatic corps, pressed so tight the collar left a red line on my neck. I had done everything right. None of it mattered. The celestial nexus orbits a neutron star called Orus Prime, a collapsed giant so dense that a teaspoon of its core material would weigh more than a mountain. The station built around it is enormous beyond easy description. It has 47 council wings, one for each member species, and a central chamber called the Grand Atrium that rises nearly 2 kilometers from floor to ceiling. The walls are transparent. You can see the neutron star pulsing outside, slow and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something ancient and cold and patient. I had studied images of the atrium for years. Standing inside it was different. The scale pressed down on you. It was designed that way. I understood that immediately. Everything about this place was designed to make you feel small. I walked to the speaker's platform. My footsteps echoed. 47 delegations watched from their raised tiers. The Volcae sat at the top in the largest tier, their emerald-black scales catching the light from Orus Prime outside. Their lead representative was called Senior Arbiter Scoth. He was the one who had laughed. He did not stop entirely even as I reached the podium. His jaw plates kept trembling with quiet amusement. The session opened in the standard fashion. A neutral voice, spoken by the Council's translation system, announced the purpose of the hearing. Earth's formal application for Council membership. 60 years of interstellar observation. 30 years of contact protocols. 6 years of pre-admission review. All of it had been building to this moment. I delivered my address. I had rehearsed it 400 times. I knew every word so well that I could have spoken it backwards. I described humanity's history, not the sanitized version, not the polished diplomatic draft, the real one. I talked about how we had spent centuries destroying ourselves and our world and somehow, despite everything, kept choosing to rebuild. I talked about our science, our art, our medicine, our exploration. I talked about the 18 nations that had set aside border disputes to fund the joint interstellar program. I talked about the children born in orbital stations who had never seen Earth's soil, but called it home anyway. I spoke for 20 minutes. Not a single delegate interrupted. When I finished, there was silence for about 4 seconds. Then Scoth spoke. He did not address me directly. He spoke to the chamber as a whole, which was itself an insult, a signal that I was not worth the courtesy of direct engagement. His translator rendered his words into flat, precise English. He said that Earth's application had been reviewed thoroughly. He said that humanity demonstrated what he called primitive instability markers, meaning our history of conflict. He said that our biology was fragile, our lifespan was short, and our emotional range was, in his words, dangerously unpredictable. He said the Volcae delegation had prepared a classification recommendation. He said Earth should be designated a Tier 3 protected ward. I had read about this classification in the legal documents. It was used for pre-sapient species, for civilizations that had not yet developed the tools to manage themselves without outside supervision. It was, in the language of galactic law, guardianship. It meant the Council would oversee Earth's development. It meant we would have no vote, no representation, and no autonomy over our own solar system's resources without council approval. It meant that 60 years of effort, of sacrifice, of reaching toward the stars with everything we had just been officially categorized as the behavior of a species that needed babysitting. I stood very still. The vote was called. The tally appeared on the chamber display in glowing numerals: 31 in favor of ward designation, 9 against, 7 abstaining. The motion passed. A council administrative officer appeared at my elbow. He was a Tilvan, small and gray-feathered, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable. He told me quietly that the session was concluded and that I would be escorted back to my vessel. There would be a formal notification package transmitted to Earth within 72 standard hours. He said he was sorry. I did not respond to that. I turned and walked back across the chamber floor. My footsteps still echoed. The Volkai gallery was quiet now. Scoth watched me go. I did not look at him. I looked straight ahead at the massive transparent wall and the neutron star beyond it, that ancient cold pulse beating slow and steady in the dark. Outside the atrium, in the corridor that led back to the diplomatic docking bay, I stopped walking. I put one hand flat against the wall. The metal was cool. I stood there for about 10 seconds, breathing slowly, letting the reality of what had just happened settle into me like cold water. They had not rejected us. Rejection would have been clean, and clean things can be dealt with. What they had done was something more deliberate. They had looked at everything we were, everything we had built and suffered and endured and created, and they had decided it added up to something that needed to be managed. They had looked at our fire and called it a hazard. They had looked at our strength and called it a problem. They had looked at 8 billion people reaching toward the stars and decided the safest thing to do was put a leash on us. I pushed off the wall and kept walking. I had a long journey home. I had a lot of thinking to do. And somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet and steady as that neutron star's pulse, something had already started turning. They thought they had settled the matter. They thought the classification was the end of the conversation. They did not understand something very fundamental about what they had just done. They had not ended anything. They had started it. I recorded my first log entry 6 hours after leaving the Nexus, while the ship was still accelerating through Volkai-controlled space. I sat in the small cabin they had assigned me, the recycled air humming through the ventilation, and I spoke into my personal recorder for almost 2 hours straight. Not for the official record, not for the diplomatic report I would eventually have to file. Just for myself, because I needed to put words to what I was feeling before it collapsed into something shapeless and consuming. What I felt was not despair. I want to be clear about that. I have met people who expected despair from me when I got back, who thought the right response to what had happened was grief or resignation or quiet acceptance. Those people did not know me very well. What I felt was something much more precise. It was the particular cold focus that comes when someone tells you that you cannot do something, and every part of your brain immediately begins calculating how to prove them wrong. I thought about what Scoth had said. I replayed it carefully, not emotionally, the way you examine a lock before deciding how to open it. He had listed our weaknesses: short lifespan, emotional volatility, history of internal conflict, biological fragility. These were the reasons humanity had been classified as a primitive ward. These were the characteristics that, in the Council's judgment, disqualified us from self-determination. I spent a long time thinking about each of those characteristics, not to dispute them but to really examine them. And the more I examined them, the more I began to notice something that Scoth had missed entirely. He had looked at each trait and seen a flaw. He had not asked, even once, what that flaw might also be. Take the short lifespan. The oldest known spacefaring species, the Velhari, live an average of 400 standard years. The Volkai live 260. Most Council species live at least a century longer than we do. To them. Our 70 or 80 years of functional life looked like a handicap. It looked like we were always in a rush, always making hasty decisions, always cutting corners because we knew our time was limited. They were not wrong about the rush. They were completely wrong about what it meant. Humans move fast because we have to. We innovate fast. We adapt fast. We make decisions under pressure better than almost any species I have studied, because pressure is the water we grew up swimming in. Every generation of humans inherits a world that is slightly different from the one their parents knew, and they have to learn it, master it, and improve it in a single lifetime. That relentless cycle is not a weakness. It is an engine. The Velhari had 400 years to solve a problem. We had 80 and we still solved it, and sometimes we solved it differently, and sometimes differently was better. The emotional volatility argument bothered me more, because it was the one with the most visible evidence behind it. I could not argue that humans were calm. We are not calm. We feel things loudly, and sometimes we act on those feelings before we have thought them through, and that has caused real damage across our history. The Council was not inventing that. They had reviewed 700 years of recorded human behavior, and they had seen the pattern clearly. What they had not seen was the other side of the pattern. Human emotion is not just a source of conflict. It is also the source of everything else. The reason a human scientist will spend 15 years on a problem that seems unsolvable is not purely rational. Rationality alone would have told that scientist to move on, to cut losses, to redirect effort toward achievable goals. What keeps a person at a problem for 15 years is something that does not calculate returns. It is something stubborn and irrational and personal, a refusal to accept a closed door, a need to know that is almost independent of the usefulness of knowing. The Volcae called that instability. I called it the reason we had gone from wood fires to fusion reactors in less than 300 years, while species with twice our lifespan had taken twice as long. And the history of internal conflict. I thought about that one for a long time, because it was true that we had spent centuries, millennia really, competing and fighting and dividing against ourselves. The Council had read those records and seen a species that could not cooperate. What they had not accounted for was what that history had done to us. Every species I had studied in my 11 years of preparation had evolved in relative isolation. They had developed cooperation because they had no serious internal competition. They had united because there was nothing much to unite against. Humans had been tested against ourselves for 100,000 years. We had every reason to splinter permanently. We were genetically diverse, culturally fragmented, spread across a planet with wildly different climates and resources, speaking thousands of different languages, worshiping different ideas, organizing ourselves into competing power structures. By any reasonable evolutionary model, we should have remained divided. Instead, across all of that friction and all of that history, we had kept finding ways to cooperate when cooperation mattered most. Not easily, not without pain, but repeatedly, stubbornly, against the odds. I reached the edge of Volcae space on the 7th day of transit and switched to a relay signal to contact Earth. The UN Secretary General was a man named Colin Farrow, who had been a quiet and careful diplomat for 30 years before reaching that office. I had worked with him for 4 of those years, and I knew him well enough to know that when his voice was very calm, he was very angry. His voice when he received my initial report was extremely calm. He asked me 3 questions. He asked whether the vote had been final. I said yes. He asked whether there was a legal appeal mechanism under Council Charter. I said technically yes, but the appeals board was composed of council members, which made any appeal essentially a request for the same people who had voted against us to reconsider. He absorbed that without comment. Then he asked the 3rd question. He asked what I thought we should do. I had been preparing my answer to that question for 7 days. I told him I did not think we should appeal. I did not think we should protest. I did not think we should petition, lobby, negotiate, or ask for anything at all. I told him that the council had made a decision based on a model of humanity that was outdated the moment they finished building it, and the only productive response was to demonstrate, conclusively and on our own terms, that the model was wrong. Colin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long would that take?" I said 10 years, maybe less. Another silence. Then send me your full analysis, encrypted. I sent it. 3 weeks later, when I was back on Earth, Colin called me into his office and told me that a closed summit had been convened, the most restricted gathering in UN history. 12 nations, 64 scientists, strategists, engineers, and military planners. No press. No leaks. He told me I would be attending as the lead civilian advisor. The summit lasted 9 days. I will not describe everything that was said in those 9 days, because some of it remains classified, and some of it was simply too raw and honest to repeat in any document that might eventually be read widely. But I will describe the feeling in that room, because the feeling was the important thing. These were serious people. They had spent their careers being careful and measured. They spoke in qualified terms and documented every claim with evidence. On the first day, there were arguments. There were competing priorities and concerns about provocation and long debates about the legal implications of various response strategies. By the third day, something had shifted. I watched it happen. The arguments did not disappear, but underneath them, something had quietly united everyone present. It was not anger exactly, though anger was there. It was something more purposeful than anger. It was the collective recognition, arriving slowly and then all at once, that they had been handed a problem they were actually built for. Humans are, at the deepest level, a problem-solving species. Give us a clear problem with high stakes and a hard deadline and step back, because we will work on it with everything we have for as long as it takes. The council had given us the clearest possible problem. They had told us exactly what they thought we could not do. They had told us precisely what the deadline was, because the ward classification review cycle was every 20 years. And they had, in their certainty that we were a managed species, stepped back entirely. On the 9th day, the summit closed. There was no dramatic announcement, no speech. The plan was recorded, sealed, and distributed to the 12 participating governments in encrypted form. A project designation was assigned. The official name was long and bureaucratic. Informally, the 64 people in that room called it by a simpler name. They called it the answer. I walked out of that building into cold morning air. The city was going about its business around me. Millions of people who did not know what had just been decided, who did not know what had been done to us or what we intended to do about it. A woman was selling coffee from a cart on the corner. 2 children were arguing about something on the steps of a building across the street, one of them waving a hand dramatically, and the other crossing their arms in the universal expression of someone who absolutely disagrees. A maintenance worker was up on a ladder fixing a light fixture, humming something quietly to himself. I stood there for a moment and just watched them. The Volkai had read our files. They had reviewed our data. They had looked at the numbers and the records and the historical patterns and built a model of what humanity was. And their model was not entirely wrong. But it was missing something that no report could capture. Something you could only see by standing on a street corner on a Tuesday morning and watching people go about their lives. We were not giving up. We were not designed to give up. It was not in us. It had never been in us. They had looked at 8 billion people and seen a liability. They had not understood that every single one of those people, from the coffee seller to the children arguing on the steps to the worker humming on his ladder, carried in them the same deep, stubborn fire that had brought us from caves to the stars. The council had misread the data, because the most important thing about humanity is not in the data. It is in the not stopping. It is in the getting up again. It is in the absolute, unreasonable, deeply human refusal to accept the version of themselves that someone else has decided on. We were going to show them what that looked like. They were not going to enjoy it. The work began on a Monday in October, in 3 locations simultaneously. A lunar installation codenamed Station Ashford, an asteroid belt construction platform designated Forge 7, and an underground research complex in Central Australia that did not appear on any civilian map and had no name at all. My name is Ilara Voss, and I was there for all of it. My official title for the duration of the project was Director of Strategic Development, which was a carefully generic name designed to appear unremarkable on any document that might be intercepted. What it actually meant was that I coordinated between the 3 sites, tracked overall progress against the plan, and served as the primary liaison to the 12-nation council that funded and oversaw everything. In practice, it meant I slept on ships more often than I slept in beds, ate most of my meals cold, and became very familiar with encrypted communication protocols. The work itself was divided into streams. I will try to describe them in plain terms because the technical details, while important, are less interesting than what they represented. The first stream was propulsion, specifically faster-than-light travel. The Council species had FTL capability. Most had possessed it for hundreds of years. Humanity had the theoretical groundwork but not the engineering solutions. That gap was the most visible symbol of our developmental lag, and closing it was the first priority. The theoretical paper that eventually became the basis for our solution had been written 7 years earlier by a woman named Alice Hartley, a 26-year-old graduate student at a university in New Zealand, who had been told twice by her thesis supervisors that her approach was too unconventional to be taken seriously. She had submitted it to 3 journals. 2 had rejected it without review. The 3rd had published it in a minor issue that was read by approximately 400 specialists worldwide. One of those specialists had flagged it in the early days of the project. I remember reading Alice's paper for the first time in a briefing folder at 30,000 feet over the Pacific. I'm not a physicist. I read it slowly, using the technical glossary attached, and by the time I finished I had the distinct and unusual sensation of reading something that was not quite possible, but was also, somehow, clearly right. I cannot explain that feeling in precise terms. It is the kind of thing that either makes sense to you or it does not. We brought Alice in on a Tuesday. She walked into the Australian facility looking like she had not slept in 2 days, which she had not, because we had sent the invitation on short notice, and she had spent the intervening time rereading her own work trying to figure out why anyone powerful enough to arrange a classified briefing had read it. She sat down across from me and said, very directly, that she needed to know what this was about before she agreed to anything. I told her what it was about. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Give me a lab and get out of my way." We gave her a lab. We did not entirely get out of her way because she needed resources and people and equipment, and obtaining those things required coordination. But we gave her as much space as we could. 18 months later, Alice Hartley presented the first working model of what we eventually called the Prometheus drive. It was the size of a small car, and it consumed an impractical amount of energy, and it only worked under very specific conditions. It was also, unambiguously, a faster-than-light propulsion mechanism. The room where she presented it held 31 people. When she activated the test model, and the readouts confirmed what they were showing, those 31 people were silent for about 4 seconds. Then someone started clapping and everyone joined in, and Alice stood at the front of the room with her arms crossed and her jaw set. And she looked like a person who had been told twice by serious academics that her ideas were not worth serious attention, and who now had a machine in front of her that said otherwise. That was the propulsion stream. The second stream was defense, hull design specifically. The problem was not creating armor strong enough to resist known weapon systems. The problem was creating armor that could adapt. Council military technology was not static. Weapons improved. A fixed defense against a known threat was useful until the threat changed, and then it was obsolete. The solution came from a materials scientist named Owen Briggs, who had spent 12 years studying the cellular repair mechanisms in human skin. That probably sounds unrelated. It was not. Owen's argument, which he made very quietly and with almost no dramatic emphasis because he was that kind of person, was that human scar tissue was a model of adaptive structural response. When skin was damaged, it did not simply repair itself to its original state. It built differently the second time. The replacement tissue was often denser and more resistant than what it replaced. The body, having recorded information about the type of damage, adjusted its response accordingly. Owen asked whether we could build a hull that did the same thing. 3 years of materials research later, we had a prototype panel that, when subjected to repeated impacts of the same type, progressively increased its resistance to that specific impact profile. It was not magic. It had limits. But it was a fundamental shift in the philosophy of armor design, from fixed protection to learning protection. And it was, as far as our intelligence suggested, unlike anything in Council military engineering. We called it adaptive plating. Owen called it, with typical understatement, the second skin. The third stream was the fleet itself. This was the largest logistical undertaking in human history, larger than any wartime shipbuilding program, larger than the interstellar program that had gotten us to the stars in the first place. The goal was 300 operational warships, designed around the Prometheus drive, sheathed in second skin plating, crewed by integrated neural link teams. The neural linking deserves its own explanation. Other Council species used AI-managed crew systems or rigid command hierarchies that prioritized precision over speed. Both approaches had weaknesses. AI systems, under sufficiently novel conditions, required time to update their operating parameters. Rigid hierarchies required decisions to travel up and down chains of command, which introduced delay. Delay in combat was the enemy of everything. Human crews, linked through a neural interface system that had been in development for 8 years before the project began, could share situational awareness directly. Not thoughts, not emotions, just data, spatial position, threat status, system readings. The effect, when it worked properly, was a crew that functioned with the collective awareness of a single organism while retaining the individual creativity of 40 separate human minds. It took time to train for. The early test sessions produced headaches and disorientation, and one memorable incident where an entire crew of 12 became convinced for approximately 90 seconds that they were all piloting the ship simultaneously. But by the 4th year of the project, we had crews who could operate a warship in Neuralink mode with a coordination level that no other known species had achieved. Because no other known species had spent 100,000 years simultaneously competing and cooperating with itself. The neural link worked so well for humans because we were, in a very deep sense, built for the particular combination of individual agency and collective function that it required. While all of this was happening, the Council sent a ward oversight delegation to Earth. This was routine. Under the ward classification protocol, designated observers were entitled to conduct status assessments every 3 years. They came in a standard diplomatic vessel, a mid-sized Volochyline transport called the Meridian Scope, and they arrived with all the calm certainty of people who expected to find exactly what they expected to find. They found a planet that was industrializing its asteroid belt. We told them it was resource extraction for orbital construction projects, which was technically true. They found a lunar installation that had expanded significantly since their last visit. We told them it was a research and communications hub, which was also technically true. They found elevated energy consumption in several regions consistent with large-scale manufacturing. We explained it as civilian infrastructure development, which was somewhat less true but entirely plausible. The lead observer, a Tilvan scientist named Ressel, wrote in his assessment report that Earth appeared to be experiencing a period of accelerated but unremarkable developmental expansion, consistent with Tier 3 projections. He noted some anomalous energy signatures from the asteroid belt that he could not fully explain, flagged them as low priority, and recommended a standard reevaluation in 3 years. His report was filed. It was reviewed by 2 council administrative officers. It was assigned a routine classification and archived. No one followed up on the energy signatures. I read a copy of his report 3 months after it was filed, through channels I will not describe in detail. I read the part about unremarkable developmental expansion and sat with it for a while. There is a particular human emotion that does not have a simple one-word name in English. It is the feeling of being significantly underestimated by someone who is very confident in their underestimation. It is not quite anger and not quite amusement and not quite pride. It is a quiet, focused thing that sits in the chest and makes you very certain and very calm about what you are going to do next. I felt that emotion for a long time while holding Ressel's report. By year 7, the Ghost fleet was 240 ships. By year 8, it was 290. By the 9th year, it reached 311, moored in the shadow side of the asteroid belt, their drives cold, their running lights off, their hulls carrying the flat, non-reflective coating that made them effectively invisible to standard council sensors at range. 311 ships, each one crewed by people who had volunteered for this, who had trained for 3 years, who had woken up every morning for 9 years knowing what they were building toward and finding reasons to keep going. The pilots were drawn from every nation on Earth. The engineers came from programs that had not existed 10 years earlier. The commanders were young, many of them, by the standards of military leadership, because we had not had a century to build the kind of seniority structure that the Volcae relied on. We had promoted on capability, on adaptability, on the specific kind of calm, pressure-welded judgment that forms when someone has been working at the edge of what is possible for years. I visited each of the 3 construction sites in the final months before completion. I walked the corridors of ships that still smelled of new metal and insulation resin. I spoke to crews in briefing rooms and in mess halls and in the narrow walkways between engine components. I was not there to give speeches. I was there because I needed to see them and because I thought they deserved to be seen. One evening at Forge 7, I was eating dinner with a group of engineers, and one of them, a quiet young man named Philip who had been with the project since its first year, asked me whether I thought it was going to work. Not the technical systems. He knew those were ready. He was asking about the bigger thing, whether the moment ahead of us was going to be what we needed it to be. I told him the honest answer. I said I did not know. I said that what we had built was extraordinary, but extraordinary things had failed before, and the outcome of the moment ahead depended on factors I could not fully control. I said that what I did know was that we had done everything possible that could be done, and that on the day it mattered, we would show up and see what happened. Philip nodded slowly. Then he said, "That's what humans do, isn't it? We just keep showing up." I thought about that for a long time afterward. The 10th year arrived. The project reached completion. The 311 ships of the Ghost fleet ran final systems checks in cold silence, out in the dark, waiting. The Council, 37 light-years away, went about its business. They managed their territories and debated their policies and reviewed their wards. They did not know what was parked in humanity's asteroid belt. They did not know what was coming. We had built it all in plain sight, behind ordinary-sounding explanations, in the gap between their expectations and our reality, and the gap had been exactly large enough. I stood on the bridge of the UNSS Challenger on the morning of the operation, with a cup of cold coffee in my hand, and the weight of 10 years pressing quietly against the back of my mind. The Challenger was our flagship. She was 2 kilometers long, wider at the stern where her 4 Prometheus drive nacelles extended outward like the spread fingers of a hand, and she carried a crew of 612 people who had been awake since 4 in the morning, running the final checks that we had already run 17 times in the preceding week. The bridge was steady and quiet. The neural link was live, which meant that every bridge officer was connected to the same shared situational awareness, a web of information passing silently between 42 human minds that made the air feel slightly charged, the way it does before rain. I was not in the command chair. That belonged to Captain Henry Marsh, who at 47 was one of the oldest commanding officers in the fleet, and who had the particular quality of stillness that comes not from coldness, but from having thought through every possible outcome and arrived at peace with all of them. He sat in his chair with his hands resting on the armrests, and he watched his displays with the expression of a man who has waited a long time for something and is now watching it arrive. What had triggered the operation was not a surprise. We had anticipated it almost exactly. The colony ship Endeavour had launched from Earth 4 decades earlier, carrying 1,200 people in long-duration suspension toward a star system designated HR 7340 in our catalogs, a yellow dwarf with 2 terrestrial planets in its habitable zone. The Endeavour was not fast by current standards. It had been built before Prometheus drives existed. It had traveled for 40 years on conventional propulsion and was now, according to our tracking, 3 months from its destination. 2 weeks before the operation, the Council had issued an edict. HR 7340 had been designated a Volkai development zone. The Endeavour was directed to reverse course and return to Earth. The edict carried the weight of Council law, which under the Ward classification made it binding on humanity without appeal. The message had been transmitted through the standard diplomatic relay and arrived with all the casual authority of a species that had never seriously considered the possibility of being refused. I had read the edict in my quarters on the Challenger with the same quiet, cold clarity I had felt standing in the atrium 10 years earlier. 1,200 people, half of them born during the journey, people who had never seen Earth and were weeks from the only home they had ever known, being ordered to turn around by a governing body they had no part in electing, on behalf of a species that wanted their destination for resource extraction. We were done waiting. The operation timing had been coordinated to the minute. At 800 ship time, Henry looked up from his displays and said quietly, "Take us in." 311 ships fired their Prometheus drives simultaneously. FTL travel feels from the inside like nothing. One moment you are somewhere, the next moment you are somewhere else. There is no sensation of speed, no visual effect, no drama. The universe simply changes around you, the way a photograph changes when you turn to a new page. At 800 we were in the asteroid belt, invisible in the dark. At 800 and approximately 3 seconds, we were 1,100 kilometers from the celestial nexus, inside its security perimeter, inside its defense grid, in a volume of space that no uninvited vessel had ever occupied in the history of the station. Every proximity alarm on the Nexus fired at once. I had reviewed intelligence on the Nexus security response protocols. The standard response time from proximity alert to active defensive weapons was 42 seconds. Our tactical teams had 40 seconds to neutralize those weapons non-lethally before any response was possible. The remaining second was margin. What followed those 40 seconds was the most controlled, precise, and quietly devastating display of military capability that the Nexus had ever recorded. Our ships did not fire on the station. They fired on the Nexus's weapon emplacements, using narrow-beam disruptors designed specifically to overload the targeting systems without causing structural damage. The emplacements did not explode. They simply went dark, one by one, in a rolling sequence that took 37 seconds and left the Nexus entirely defenseless. At second 38, Henry opened a channel to the Nexus control center. His voice was completely even. He said, "This is Captain Henry Marsh of the United Nations ship Challenger. We are here to address an item of urgent business before the Galactic Council. We mean no harm to this station or its personnel. Please open the Council channel." There was a pause of about 12 seconds. Then the Council channel opened. The Grand Atrium was in full session. 47 species, the full weight of galactic governance. I looked at the view screen and felt briefly the same sensation I had felt 10 years earlier walking onto that floor. The difference was that this time I was not asking for anything. I stepped to the forward communications console and opened my channel. My voice would reach every translator in that chamber simultaneously. I began with the legal brief. I know that sounds anticlimactic. It was not. We had spent 3 years preparing a document that ran to 840 pages in its full form. The executive summary alone was 40 pages. What it demonstrated, clearly and with exhaustive citation of Council Charter law, procedural code, and precedent, was that the ward classification vote 10 years earlier had been conducted in violation of the Council's own founding charter. The charter required that any species subject to a guardianship determination be provided with qualified legal representation. We had been provided with none. It required that a developmental assessment be conducted by an independent panel. The panel that had assessed us had included 3 Volcae-aligned species with documented territorial interests in Earth's solar system. It required that the subject species be informed of the vote and given 30 days to respond before the classification took effect. We had been informed after the vote was already final. Every single procedural requirement had been violated. The classification was not just unjust, it was, under the Council's own laws, invalid. I transmitted the full brief to every Council terminal simultaneously while I spoke. I watched the displays in the chamber. Delegates from a dozen species were already reading. Several were consulting their legal advisors in urgent whispered exchanges. Then I moved to the second part. I said that Earth had chosen not to pursue a legal appeal through Council channels because we had no confidence in the impartiality of any appeals process conducted by the same body that had wrongly classified us. I said instead that we proposed a different resolution, not membership in the Council under existing terms, not wardship. A new designation, one that the Council Charter actually allowed for but had never used, a designation for spacefaring civilizations of independent standing that chose to engage with the Council as equal parties rather than as subjects. The Charter called this designation sovereign recognition. It had been written into the founding documents as a theoretical provision and had sat unused for 600 years. We were formally requesting it, on behalf of Earth and all of humanity. While I was speaking, something else was happening. I watched it on the side display that showed the chamber feed. The Volcae delegation had risen. Scoth himself was on his feet, his jaw plates moving. He was trying to get the floor. He had the body language of a being who was accustomed to that floor being given to him without question, and was encountering, possibly for the first time, a situation where he could not immediately determine how to proceed. I had planned for this. At the moment that Scoth appeared ready to address the chamber, I cut my transmission channel for exactly 11 seconds. I had chosen 11 seconds with care, long enough to be noticed, short enough that it could not be characterized as a system failure. It was a choice, deliberate and visible, and what it communicated was this: I am not finished, and you will wait. The chamber went very still. When I reactivated the channel, I said calmly, I was not finished. 3 things happened in the following 90 seconds that I had hoped for but not guaranteed. The first was that the Tilvan delegation's lead representative rose and formally endorsed our legal brief, calling for an emergency procedural review. The Tilvan had been dealing with Volcae administrative pressure for 2 generations, and they had read the brief very quickly and arrived at its implications immediately. The second was that 2 other species, the Arin and the Queleth, Both formally seconded the Tilvan motion. Neither of them had historically challenged the Volcae on procedural grounds. The sight of 311 human ships sitting inside the Nexus defense perimeter, with the weapon emplacements quiet around them, appeared to have sharpened their willingness to act on positions they had held privately for a long time. The third thing was that Scoth sat back down. He did not leave the chamber. He did not formally yield. He simply sat down, which in Volcae body language means something specific and significant. It means that the individual in question has assessed the situation and determined that the current moment is not the optimal moment for the action they had intended. It is not surrender. It is strategic patience. I knew enough about Volcae culture to recognize it, and I knew what it meant for the next steps. Captain Henry Marsh, from his chair 10 feet behind me, said quietly and only to me, "That's it then." I said, "Not quite yet, but close." The emergency procedural review was called. It would take 3 council days, which translated to approximately 72 Earth hours. We were asked to withdraw to a designated holding position outside the Nexus perimeter. We complied. We had demonstrated what we needed to demonstrate. There was no benefit to remaining inside the perimeter unnecessarily. As we withdrew, I watched the Nexus through the forward viewport. The station was enormous and ancient, and it had existed before humanity had learned to write. It had seen civilizations rise and be catalogued and placed in their tiers and managed and occasionally forgotten. It had been, for its entire existence, a place where the strong organized the universe to their own preferences and called that organization governance. We had not changed that entirely, not in a single day, but we had introduced something the station had never contained before: genuine uncertainty. The Council did not know, for the first time in a very long time, exactly what was going to happen next. That uncertainty was the point. Henry ordered the fleet to holding position. 612 people on the Challenger let out a breath that seemed to happen all at once, which, given the neural link, it actually did. Someone in the aft engineering section started laughing, and through the link it rippled faintly forward, not audible but felt, a wave of released tension that passed through 42 connected minds and came out the other side as something warmer and more complicated than simple relief. I sat down in the observer's chair to the left of Henry's station and looked at the star field on the main display. Orus Prime was visible off the port bow, that old neutron star still pulsing, slow and steady. I thought about the woman who had stood on that chamber floor 10 years ago and had been laughed at, had been classified, had been escorted out without appeal. I thought about the 9 days in that summit room, the 10 years of work, the coffee cellar on the corner and the children arguing on the steps and Philip asking me whether it was going to work. Henry spoke without looking away from his display. He said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "Alice Hartley." He nodded as if that made complete sense, which to him it probably did. We waited. The stars were very steady outside. The Nexus sat 300 kilometers off our bow, enormous and humming with internal communications we could not fully intercept. Somewhere in that station, 47 species were trying to figure out what to do about something they had never accounted for. Something they had created 10 years ago without knowing it. We waited, and we were very patient, because patience was one of the things we had learned to be. 20 years have passed since that day outside the Nexus. I know that because my granddaughter Clara launched yesterday on her first interstellar posting, assigned to the newly established Terran Diplomatic Bureau at the Celestial Nexus. I watched her ship from my garden in Devon, a small gleaming point of light moving steadily through the morning sky until it was gone. I stood there for a while after it disappeared, with the grass wet against my shoes and a cup of tea growing cold in my hand, and I thought about time. My name is Ilara Voss. I am 63 years old. I retired from active service 4 years ago, at the recommendation of my doctor and the more insistent recommendation of my body, which had spent 20 years absorbing the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from carrying weight. I live in a house in Devon with a garden I am slowly learning to manage, and a library of books, both physical and digital, that takes up most of what should be the dining room. I write occasionally. I speak at universities sometimes. I sleep better than I did when I was 43, which I consider one of the better outcomes of this particular story. Let me tell you how it resolved, not the dramatic version, the real version, which is longer and less clean and more interesting. The council's emergency procedural review took 4 days, not 3. The additional day was needed because 3 separate legal subcommittees formed spontaneously to review different aspects of our brief, and coordinating their findings required time. I spent those 4 days on the Challenger, working from a temporary office they had set up for me in the ship's research module, eating meals at my desk and sleeping in short intervals, and reading the legal proceedings as they were transmitted to us through the official diplomatic relay. The review confirmed our central claim. The ward classification vote had been procedurally invalid under Council Charter on 3 distinct grounds. The legal subcommittees, to their credit, did not spend time arguing about whether they liked the conclusion. They followed the evidence. The charter was clear. The vote was void. This created an immediate and significant problem for the Council, because voiding the classification did not automatically grant us sovereign recognition. It simply meant we were unclassified. In the 600 years of the Council's existence, no species had ever been unclassified. The administrative and political infrastructure for dealing with us did not exist. We had not just knocked over a piece on the board. We had introduced a piece that the board had no space for. The Voakai response took longer than I expected, and when it came, it was not what I had anticipated. Scoth did not address the chamber. He requested a private meeting, with me specifically, not with a delegation, not with a committee, with me personally. I considered that request for 2 hours before accepting it. I accepted it because I trusted my read of Voakai strategic behavior, and my read was that a request for a private meeting was not a trap. Traps, in Voakai culture, were laid elaborately in advance and then sprung in public to maximize their effect. A private meeting request meant something different. It meant they wanted information they could not get from the public proceedings. Specifically, I suspected Scoth wanted to understand how we had done what we had done, because the gap between what their 3-year-old assessment report had predicted about Earth and what Earth had actually produced was large enough to be uncomfortable for anyone who relied on predictive modeling. We met in a small conference room in the neutral section of the Nexus, the wing reserved for non-member contacts. There were 2 Tilvan observers present as witnesses, which was standard practice for any Voakai human interaction at that stage. Scoth arrived with a single aide and no display of ceremony. He sat across the table from me, and he looked at me for a moment in the particular way that Voakai have of assessing something, their vision adapted for fine detail at close range, eyes tracking slightly. Then he said, in his own language through the translator, "How?" Not a greeting, not a preamble, just the one word. I said, "You want to know how we built a fleet without you detecting it?" He said that was part of what he wanted to know. I told him that the answer was simpler than he probably expected. We had told him exactly what we were doing, at every stage. We had described each component of the project in language that was accurate but framed within the context of civilian development. He had seen the energy signatures from the asteroid belt. His observer had noted them. They had been filed as low priority because they were consistent with what the Ward classification model predicted Earth would be doing at our developmental stage. We had not hidden our work. We had simply hidden it in plain sight, inside the expectation that we were not capable of anything worth taking seriously. Scoth was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I did not expect. He said that he understood the answer, and that the answer indicated a level of strategic sophistication that the Voakai assessment model was not equipped to measure, because the model had been built on the assumption that a species classified as Tier 3 would not think to work inside the classification's blind spots. He said this without apparent embarrassment, which told me something important. The Volcae, whatever their faults, were capable of honest assessment when it served their interests, and it was clearly in their interests to understand what had happened. I said that the model had been wrong because it measured our outputs without measuring our inputs. It had looked at what we had produced so far and projected forward from that baseline. It had not accounted for what we were capable of producing when we had a clear reason to produce it. He asked what reason that had been. I said the reason was him, the vote, the classification, the laugh in the upper gallery. Another silence, longer this time. He said, "You built all of this because we insulted you." I said that was not quite accurate. I said we built it because he had told us what we were, and we had found that unacceptable. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said that the Volcae had been spacefaring for 600 years, and in that time they had encountered 143 species capable of interstellar travel. And in their experience, a species that responds to classification by spending a decade building a covert fleet and then appearing inside your defense perimeter while citing your own legal code against you was not a species that could be meaningfully categorized. I said that we were aware of that. That was why we had requested the sovereign recognition designation. He said the Volcae delegation would not oppose the designation. I had not expected that either. I had expected a fight, a negotiation, a long process of concessions and counter-proposals. What I got instead was a being who had done the math and arrived at the only rational conclusion available. The sovereign recognition motion was formally put before the council 2 days later. It passed, not unanimously, but with a majority large enough to be decisive. 13 species voted against, mostly Volcae-aligned delegations that had more institutional loyalty than independent judgment. The rest voted in favor, some enthusiastically, some cautiously, some with the specific relief of beings who had wanted to vote this way for other reasons for a long time, and had finally been given a context in which doing so was safe. Earth was granted sovereign recognition. A new tier of designation was formally created in the Council Charter. We were the first occupants of it. We would not be the last. The following years were not simple. Sovereignty is not a gift you receive and then relax with. It is a posture you maintain constantly, through thousands of small decisions and negotiations and confrontations and compromises. And some days it is exhausting, and some days it is deeply satisfying, and most days it is both at once. I spent 6 of the years after the Nexus operation as Earth's first sovereign ambassador to the Council, living on the Nexus for stretches of 4 and 6 months at a time, building the relationships and establishing the precedents that would eventually become normal enough that my successor could walk into that role without starting from nothing. The Tilvan became our closest allies in the Council, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. They were a species that had been waiting for decades for someone to demonstrate that the Volcae's grip on procedural outcomes could be successfully challenged. We had provided that demonstration. They were not sentimental about it, but they were consistent, and consistency in alliance is worth more than enthusiasm. The 3 council species that had voted against us at that first hearing 10 years before the Nexus operation, species with documented territorial interests in Earth's solar system, were required under the terms of the Sovereign Recognition Framework to formally relinquish any claims they had made under the Ward classification period. That process was contentious and slow, and at one point required a direct meeting between myself and the Volcae ambassador, during which neither of us said anything pleasant for approximately 40 minutes. But it resolved. Things that are structurally correct tend to resolve, eventually, even when the people responsible for resolving them would prefer not to. The Endeavour completed its journey to HR 7340. The colony ship arrived at its destination 3 months after the Nexus operation concluded, and the people aboard it, those 1,200 souls who had never seen Earth and had spent their lives traveling toward a world that had briefly been taken from them by someone else's decision, landed on the surface of the first terrestrial planet in that system on a morning that was broadcast live across Earth. I watched that broadcast from my office at the Nexus. The footage was slightly delayed by distance, slightly grainy, but clear enough to see the ramp come down, clear enough to see the first person walk out onto the surface. A young man named Daniel who had been born on the ship and was now standing on alien soil for the first time in his life, looking up at an unfamiliar sky with an expression that I recognized, not surprise, but arrival. HR 7340 is now a full human colony system. 308,000 people live there as of the last census I read. They call the first planet Endeavour, after the ship. I have been asked many times to describe what the key moment was. People want a pivot point, a single decision or event that changed everything. I understand the desire for that. Stories are easier to carry when they have a clear turning point. The honest answer is that there was not one. There were 10 years of turning points. There was Alice Hartley deciding, for the third time, not to abandon her paper. There was Owen Briggs spending 12 years studying human skin because he found it genuinely fascinating. There was Philip asking me a question at dinner that I still think about. There was Colin Farrow asking me 3 questions in a very calm voice. There was Henry Marsh sitting in his command chair with his hands on the armrests, patient and steady and entirely without doubt. There were 612 people on the Challenger and 311 ships in the dark, and 10 years of work by people who believed, without being able to prove it in advance, that the work would matter. Every one of those moments was the key moment. I think about the Volkai sometimes, not with anger, which surprised me when I noticed it. Anger would have been easier to understand. What I feel instead is something more like the particular fatigue that comes after a long argument that you have won on points, but that has not entirely resolved the underlying disagreement. Scott and I spoke 3 more times after our private meeting at the Nexus. The conversations were always careful and always honest, in the specific way that conversations between people with significant power over each other's interests tend to be. The Volkai are not reformed. They are not our friends. They are a species that assessed us incorrectly, encountered the consequences of that error, and adjusted their position accordingly. That is, in my estimation, about the best outcome that was realistically available, and I find it adequate. What I find more interesting to think about is the 6 species that opposed the Volkai on the floor of the council chamber on the day of the sovereign recognition vote. Not because they had suddenly changed their values, but because we had changed the conditions. For years, they had disagreed with the way the council was managed, and had not acted on that disagreement because acting alone was not survivable. What we provided, without intending to in any strategic sense, was a demonstration that the arrangement could be challenged, that the challenge could succeed, that the success would not destroy everything in its wake. 3 of those species have since pursued significant renegotiations of their own council terms. 2 more are in preliminary discussions. The Queleth have introduced 4 procedural reform motions in the past decade. 2 passed. We did not set out to change the council. We set out to change our own position within it. But those 2 things turned out to be connected in ways that neither we nor the council had fully anticipated. Clara, my granddaughter, is 24 years old. She studied interstellar law and diplomatic practice, and she is fluent in 2 alien languages, and she spent her 3rd university year living at the Nexus as a junior researcher, which she described in her messages home as the most overwhelming and exciting experience of her life in roughly equal proportions. She has her grandmother's tendency to go very still when she is thinking hard about something, and her mother's particular stubbornness about problems she has decided are worth solving, and something else, some quality of presence, that I cannot entirely name but that I recognize because I have seen it in many of the people who mattered most across the 10 years I have been describing. It is the quality of a person who does not accept the room's definition of what is possible. I watched her ship leave yesterday. I stood in the garden with my cold tea and the wet grass, and I watched that point of light until it was gone. And I thought about all the things I did not say to her before she left, not because I did not want to say them, but because some things are better understood by living them than by being told. I wanted to tell her that the moment she steps onto the Nexus, she will feel the weight of the place, and that feeling is designed, and that she should not let it convince her of something untrue about herself. I wanted to tell her that the species that laughed at us in that chamber did so because they could not imagine what we would do next, and that the inability to imagine us has always been their problem, not ours. I wanted to tell her about Alice Hartley, standing at the front of a room with her arms crossed, looking at a machine that proved everyone wrong. I wanted to tell her that the Voakai made one mistake, not the political mistake of opposing us, and not the military mistake of assuming our weapons were primitive. The deeper mistake, the philosophical one. They looked at everything that makes us human, the speed and the fire and the stubborn refusal and the pain that becomes motivation and the chaos that becomes creativity, and they saw a list of problems to be managed rather than a description of what we are. They did not understand that those things are not our flaws holding us back from something better. They are the something better. They are what we are made of. And the universe, as it turns out, had not yet seen what we could do with them. I put my cold tea down on the garden wall and went inside. The morning was getting brighter. There were things to do. There were always things to do, and the garden needed attention before the afternoon rain came. And somewhere 37 light-years away, a young woman with her grandmother's stillness was sitting in a diplomatic transport watching the stars and thinking about what happened next. We do not stop. That is the whole secret. We have never stopped, not once in the entire history of our strange and stubborn and remarkable species, and we are not going to start now. The galaxy made one mistake. It thought that was a weakness. It was not.